On the morning of May the 23rd, 1945, the revelation came true. Werner Heisenberg had been captured 3 weeks earlier by American forces in Bavaria, along with 9 other leading German physicists. But as these scientists sat in Farm Hall, a Georgian manor house near Cambridge that served as their gilded cage, listening to hidden microphones record their conversations, they confronted something they had dismissed throughout the war. They confronted British scientific coordination. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. While Germany's greatest minds had worked in isolation, competing for resources and duplicating efforts, British scientists had operated as a unified system. While German research centres had hoarded information and refused to share breakthroughs, British laboratories had coordinated their work across universities, military installations and industrial facilities. While German physicists had pursued theoretical elegance, British researchers had focused relentlessly on practical applications that won battles. What those German scientists learned in the weeks after capture was not just that they had lost the war, it was the visible proof of everything their most perceptive colleagues had warned them about since 1940. And as the transcripts of their conversations reveal, the physicists who had led Germany's war research were left to contemplate a truth they had suspected but refused to believe. Britain's scientific superiority was never the secret. The secret was that Germany's best scientists had known about the coordination gap all along and still failed to change their system. This is the story of what German scientists said about British war science, both before and after they saw the scale of what they had been facing. The warning began with a man who understood British research better than almost any scientist in Nazi Germany. Werner Heisenberg had spent crucial years in Britain during the 1920s and early 1930s. From 1924 to 1927, he worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, which maintained close ties with British physics establishments. He visited Cambridge repeatedly, working alongside Paul Dirac and other leading British physicists. He lectured at Manchester and Oxford. He was 23 years old during his first extended stay in Cambridge. He had already made groundbreaking contributions to quantum mechanics. He bore the intellectual confidence of youth combined with the precision of German scientific training. But nothing in his theoretical work prepared him for what he would encounter in British scientific culture. He learned how British researchers collaborated. Unlike the hierarchical German system where professors guarded their domains jealously, British scientists moved fluidly between institutions. They shared preliminary results before publication. They invited colleagues to critique their work. They built networks across universities that facilitated rapid exchange of ideas. These were not the characteristics of isolated genius. These were the characteristics of coordinated inquiry. Heisenberg studied under British physicists and observed how they balanced theory with application. German science traditionally viewed practical work as beneath pure research. The greatest minds focused on fundamental questions. Engineering applications were left to lesser talents. But British scientists he encountered showed no such snobbery. They moved effortlessly between theoretical physics and practical problems. They saw no contradiction between pursuing elegant mathematics and building functional devices. 3 observations particularly impressed him during his time in Britain. First, universities collaborated with industry in ways unimaginable in Germany. British corporations funded research chairs. Scientists consulted for private companies. The boundaries between academic and commercial work were permeable. Second, the government invested heavily in scientific infrastructure without demanding ideological conformity. Research was supported based on merit, not political reliability. Third, and most importantly, British science operated on principles of open debate and peer review that produced rapid error correction and continuous refinement of ideas. Heisenberg returned to Germany, recognizing that British science possessed structural advantages that had nothing to do with individual brilliance and everything to do with institutional organization. Throughout the 1930s, as Nazi ideology increasingly dominated German universities, scientific coordination deteriorated. Jewish scientists were expelled, removing many of Germany's most talented researchers. Political reliability became more important than scientific competence in appointments. Research institutes competed for funding from military services that pursued contradictory priorities. The Luftwaffe wanted its own research programs. The Navy demanded separate investigations. The Army refused to share findings with other services, and academic institutions guarded their autonomy fiercely, resisting any attempt at central coordination. Heisenberg and other scientists warned that this fragmentation would cripple German war research. They argued that modern warfare required scientific coordination on an unprecedented scale. They explained that Britain and America would integrate their research efforts in ways Germany could not match. Their warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. Nazi ideology celebrated individual German genius over systematic cooperation. The regime assumed that superior racial characteristics would overcome any organizational disadvantages. When war came in September 1939, the fragmentation of German science became immediately apparent. Multiple research teams began working on similar problems without coordination. The Reich Research Council, established to organize scientific work, lacked authority to compel cooperation. Military services continued to run independent programs. Universities resisted military oversight, and the most critical projects suffered from inadequate resources and poor priority setting. The German nuclear program exemplified these failures. Multiple research groups investigated atomic physics with little coordination. Heisenberg led one effort in Leipzig and later Berlin. Another team worked in Dahlem under Otto Hahn. A third group operated at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. They competed for scarce resources, they duplicated experiments, they reached different conclusions about feasibility. Most critically, they never received the industrial support necessary to build production facilities. German leadership never committed fully to atomic research because the timeline seemed too long and the prospects too uncertain. Meanwhile, British scientists were organizing on a scale that would have seemed impossible to German observers. In 1939, the British government established the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, later reorganised as the Ministry of Aircraft Production's Research Division. This body coordinated research across dozens of institutions. Universities contributed personnel and facilities. Private companies provided manufacturing expertise. Military services defined operational requirements. And scientists moved freely between academic, industrial, and government laboratories, carrying ideas and techniques across institutional boundaries. The system was imperfect and often chaotic, but it was coordinated in ways German science never achieved. The first devastating application of British scientific coordination was radar. German scientists had investigated radio detection in the 1930s. They understood the basic principles. They built experimental systems that could detect aircraft. But German radar development was fragmented across multiple competing programs with inconsistent support. The Luftwaffe developed one system. The Navy built a different one. The Army created a third version. Each service guarded its technology and refused to share breakthroughs. When war began, German radar was years behind British capabilities. The British had established a unified radar research program under Henry Tizard in 1935. The system became known as Chain Home, a network of radar stations along Britain's coast that could detect incoming aircraft from over 100 miles away. The stations operated on a common frequency and fed information to a central control system. Fighter Command could track German raids in real time and direct interceptors to specific locations. German pilots flying over Britain in 1940 reported being intercepted with uncanny accuracy. British fighters appeared precisely where needed, as if the British knew exactly where German formations were flying. They did know. The Chain Home system was not just radar, it was an integrated air defence network linking radar stations observer corps, fighter control rooms, and airfields into a coordinated system. Information flowed from detection to command to interception in minutes. German intelligence suspected radar was involved, but German leadership fundamentally misunderstood the scale. They assumed Britain had a few experimental radar sets at key locations. They never imagined an integrated network covering the entire coast, backed by coordinated command and control systems that turned technological capability into operational advantage. When German scientists examined captured British radar equipment later in the war, they were shocked by its sophistication. British cavity magnetrons generated radio waves at frequencies and powers that German equipment could not match. The devices represented years of coordinated research across universities and industrial laboratories, combining theoretical physics, precision engineering, and manufacturing expertise that German science, divided and competitive, could not replicate. The second revelation was British codebreaking. German military communications used Enigma machines, electromechanical cipher devices that generated encrypted messages. German cryptographers believed Enigma was unbreakable. The machines had millions of possible settings. Even if an enemy captured one, they would need to know the daily key settings to decrypt messages. German operators changed settings daily. Messages transmitted one day could not be read by someone intercepting messages the next day. The system seemed perfectly secure. But German confidence rested on a fundamental misconception. They assumed code-breaking was an individual intellectual challenge where lone geniuses applied mathematics to crack ciphers. They did not understand that Britain had industrialized code-breaking, turning it into a systematic scientific and engineering process. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion north of London, British codebreakers employed over 10,000 people by 1945. The operation combined mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword experts, engineers, and thousands of support staff. They built specialized computing machines, the Bombes, that could test thousands of potential Enigma settings per hour. When German operators made mistakes in procedure, British analysts catalogued them systematically. When German messages included predictable content, British linguists identified the patterns. When captured documents revealed key settings, British clerks integrated the intelligence immediately. The scale of the operation was industrial. Bletchley Park operated like a factory, processing intercepted messages through sequential departments where specialists performed specific tasks. Raw intercepts arrived, were sorted, analyzed for patterns, tested against known solutions, decrypted if possible, translated and disseminated to military commanders, all within hours of transmission. German scientists never suspected the scale of British code-breaking. They knew some lower-level codes had been broken. They assumed it was isolated successes by small teams. When operational intelligence suggested British foreknowledge of German plans, German commanders blamed espionage, not systematic code-breaking. The possibility that Britain had built an industrial-scale code-breaking facility, employing thousands of people, seemed absurd. Germany had its own code-breaking service, the B-Dienst, which achieved some successes against Allied naval codes. But the German operation was small, poorly funded, and isolated from the broader intelligence system. It represented exactly the fragmented, under-resourced approach that characterized all German scientific warfare. The third British advantage was operational research, a new scientific discipline that applied mathematical analysis to military operations. British scientists embedded themselves with military units, observed operations, collected data, and used statistical analysis to improve tactics and equipment. The concept seemed obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary in practice. German military tradition emphasized courage, initiative, and battlefield intuition. Decisions were made by experienced commanders using judgment honed through years of service. The idea that civilian scientists with mathematical training could improve military effectiveness seemed insulting to German officers. British scientists were not insulted, they were employed. Operational research teams analysed convoy routing and determined optimal ship spacing that minimised U-boat success. They studied bomber accuracy and calculated the most effective bombing altitudes and patterns. They investigated anti-submarine tactics and identified that increasing the frequency of patrols was more effective than extending their duration. Every finding was tested, refined, and implemented across the service. The results were measurable and devastating. In the Battle of the Atlantic, operational research helped transform British anti-submarine warfare from reactive defence to proactive hunting. Scientists calculated where U-boats were most vulnerable and recommended concentrating forces there. They analysed attack data and determined that aircraft equipped with depth charges set to shallow detonation were far more effective than previously assumed. The recommendations were implemented immediately. U-boat losses increased dramatically. German submariners noticed that British tactics seemed to anticipate their movements and exploit their vulnerabilities with scientific precision. They were facing scientific warfare, and they did not recognise it. By 1942, perceptive German scientists were warning that they faced a coordinated Allied scientific effort on a scale Germany could not match. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, who worked with Heisenberg on nuclear research, wrote to colleagues expressing concern that Germany was losing the scientific war. He noted that Allied technical developments appeared to be accelerating while German progress stagnated. He suggested that organisational problems, rather than lack of talent, explained the gap. His warnings were ignored. Nazi leadership remained confident that German scientific genius would prevail. They pointed to German achievements in rocketry, jet aircraft, and advanced submarines as proof of superiority. What they failed to understand was that these individual successes occurred despite organisational chaos, not because of it. And British coordinated research was producing more numerous, if individually less spectacular, advances that were actually changing the war's outcome. In 1943, the organisational failure became catastrophic. Germany needed technological breakthroughs to counter overwhelming Allied material superiority. But German research remained fragmented and poorly coordinated. The V-2 rocket program consumed enormous resources without producing strategic results. Jet aircraft development was delayed by competing designs and organisational infighting. Advanced submarine types entered production too late to affect the war. Each program represented brilliant German engineering, but none were integrated into a coherent technological strategy that addressed Germany's strategic problems. Meanwhile, Allied research coordination was producing war-winning results. Proximity fuses made anti-aircraft fire devastatingly effective. Improved radar enabled all-weather bombing. Better sonar and depth charges decimated U-boats. Coordinated logistics and operational research optimized supply chains and force deployment. The Allies were not smarter, they were more organized. The scale of Allied scientific coordination became undeniable after D-Day. German forces in Normandy encountered technology they had never seen. Allied aircraft operated with electronic countermeasures that jammed German radar. Allied artillery used proximity-fused shells that exploded at optimal altitude, shredding German positions with airbursts. Allied tanks featured gyroscopic stabilization, allowing accurate fire while moving. Allied logistics benefited from operational research that optimized fuel distribution and ammunition supply. German soldiers reported fighting an enemy whose technological superiority seemed overwhelming. German commanders requested scientific support to counter Allied advantages. But German research facilities were being bombed, scientists were being drafted into military service, and coordination had collapsed completely. After Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams swept across the country, capturing German scientists and seizing research facilities. Operation Paperclip and similar programs brought hundreds of German scientists to Britain and America for interrogation and potential recruitment. The interrogations revealed how completely German scientists had misunderstood Allied research. They were shocked to learn about Bletchley Park's scale. They were astounded by the Manhattan Project's organization, where over 130,000 people worked at multiple sites to build atomic weapons. They expressed disbelief at the coordination between Allied universities, industries, and militaries, and they admitted that German science, despite its individual brilliance, had been organizationally crippled from the start. The farm hall transcripts provide the most revealing evidence of German scientists' realization. British intelligence held 10 captured German physicists in a country house, recorded their conversations secretly, and translated the transcripts for analysis. On August 6, 1945, the scientists learned that America had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The recordings captured their reactions. Initial disbelief gave way to shock and then introspection. How had the Allies built an atomic weapon while Germany's nuclear program had barely achieved a functioning reactor? The discussions revealed several crucial misjudgments. The German scientists had assumed atomic weapons would require decades to develop. They had convinced themselves that the theoretical challenges were insurmountable in wartime. They had believed that no nation would commit the resources necessary for such an uncertain project. They were wrong about all of it. Over the following days, as more information about the Manhattan Project emerged, the German scientists' conversations revealed growing comprehension of what they had missed. The Manhattan Project had employed over 130,000 people at its peak. It had built entire cities, Oak Ridge in Tennessee and Hanford in Washington, dedicated to producing fissionable material. It had coordinated research across dozens of universities. It had mobilized American industry to build unprecedented facilities. It represented exactly the kind of massive, coordinated scientific effort that Germany had proven incapable of organizing. Heisenberg and his colleagues had to confront a painful truth. They had not failed to build atomic weapons because they were less intelligent than their Allied counterparts. They had failed because German science was fragmented, poorly funded, and organizationally dysfunctional. The interrogations of other German scientists revealed similar patterns. Researchers who had worked on jet engines expressed frustration that their work had been delayed by competing designs and inadequate industrial support. Scientists who had developed advanced radar were bitter that their innovations had not been implemented broadly because of inter-service rivalries. Chemists who had created synthetic materials complained that lack of coordination meant their discoveries were not utilized effectively. The common thread was organizational failure. German science possessed talented individuals who made remarkable discoveries, but it lacked the institutional structure to turn discoveries into deployed capabilities that affected the war's outcome. British and American interrogators compiled extensive reports analyzing German scientific weaknesses. These reports, many still classified for decades after the war, painted a devastating picture. German research was characterized by poor coordination between military services, inadequate communication between academic and industrial research, insufficient government funding and priority setting, ideological interference that expelled talented scientists and imposed political criteria on research, and fundamental misunderstanding of how modern scientific warfare required systematic organization rather than individual genius. The reports concluded that Allied victory was partly due to superior scientific coordination that enabled faster innovation, better resource allocation, and more effective translation of research into operational capabilities. The fundamental truth that emerged from interrogations and captured documents was simple and stark. Germany had attacked nations with superior scientific organization. German scientists were individually brilliant, but brilliance fragmented across competing institutions, starved of resources and isolated from systematic coordination. could not compete with Allied science that was less brilliant, but far better organized. Britain coordinated research across universities, industries, and military services. America mobilized its vast industrial and scientific base for war research. The two nations shared information, exchanged personnel, and pooled resources. By 1943, the Allies were outproducing Germany in both quantity and quality of war technology, and German scientists, working in isolation with inadequate support, could not close the gap. Heisenberg lived until 1976, long enough to witness the Cold War's scientific competition and reflect extensively on Germany's scientific failure. In his memoirs and interviews, he acknowledged that organizational problems had crippled German war research more than any lack of talent. He admitted that British scientific coordination had been superior from the start. He explained that German scientists had warned about the coordination gap but lacked the political power to change the system. But he also revealed a more painful realization. German scientists had been complicit in their own failure. They had accepted the fragmented system because it gave them autonomy. They had resisted coordination because they preferred independence to collaboration. They had tolerated poor government support because they valued academic freedom over practical effectiveness. In seeking to preserve their individual research domains, they had collectively ensured German science would lose the war. Other German scientists expressed similar reflections in post-war years. Those who worked in Allied research facilities after the war experienced coordinated science firsthand. They saw how British and American laboratories shared information freely, how researchers moved between institutions carrying expertise, how government and industry collaborated on development, how systematic organization multiplied individual contributions. What they experienced was not necessarily more brilliant than German science, but it was more effective. And effectiveness, not brilliance, determined which technologies reached the battlefield in time to matter. The lesson of Allied scientific coordination extends beyond World War II. Heisenberg and other German scientists possessed knowledge and skills equal to any researchers in the world. But they worked within an organizational structure that fragmented efforts, duplicated work, and failed to mobilize resources effectively. British and American science was not necessarily smarter, but it was systematically organized to accelerate innovation, share breakthroughs, and deploy capabilities rapidly. The Allies proved that in modern warfare, scientific organization matters more than individual genius. Coordinated teams of good scientists will defeat fragmented groups of brilliant ones. As those German scientists sat in Farm Hall, learning about Allied scientific achievements they had never suspected, they understood something their government had never grasped. The war had not been lost to enemy brilliance. It had been lost to enemy organization. British radar had defeated the Luftwaffe because it was coordinated with fighter command and defense networks. British codebreaking had anticipated German operations because it was industrial in scale and systematically organized. British operational research had optimized tactics and logistics because scientists and military worked together. And the Manhattan Project had built atomic weapons because America could coordinate research across a continent and mobilize resources on a scale Germany never attempted. The Germans had known about the organizational advantage throughout the war. They had simply refused to believe it mattered more than individual genius. If you found this account of German scientists' realization about Allied scientific coordination valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. We are dedicated to bringing you accurate historical content based on verified sources and documented testimony. Share this video with others who appreciate understanding history from multiple perspectives, and leave a comment telling us which aspect of World War II scientific warfare you would like us to explore next. Your support allows us to continue producing educational content that brings important historical lessons to new audiences.